The dawn breaks over the Arabian Gulf with an ominous silence. This is not the peaceful silence of a tranquil morning. This is the deafening quiet before catastrophe. January 30th, 2026, a moment that will reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Somewhere in the vast expanse between the Persian Gulf and the skies above Iran, machines of war are moving into position. Not ships, not ground troops, but something far more lethal and infinitely more sophisticated. They are the apex predators of modern aerial warfare. America's legendary stealth fighters, cutting through the darkness with the precision of surgical instruments and the lethality of guided missiles. The tension has been mounting for weeks. On January 14th, Iran issued threats of retaliation against what they called imminent American aggression. Western intelligence agencies confirmed the unthinkable: a massive armada was assembling. The USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., with its highly advanced missile launch systems, the USS Spruance bristling with powerful radar and sensor systems, and flotillas of support vessels stretched across the Arabian Gulf like a metallic serpent preparing to strike. Drones and PA-8 Poseidon spy planes hunted ceaselessly near Iranian airspace, their electronic eyes piercing through cloud and darkness. President Trump had made his intentions crystal clear. On January 29th, he announced that a massive armada was heading toward Iranian territory. The world watched with bated breath as the machinery of American military might, the most formidable war machine ever assembled by human hands, began its inexorable march toward the confrontation that would change everything. But this wasn't merely about raw firepower or numerical superiority. This was about something far more profound. This was about technological dominance so complete, so overwhelming, that it rendered enemy defenses almost meaningless. This was the story of how America's stealth fighters didn't just penetrate Iranian defenses. They made those defenses invisible, ineffective, and utterly obsolete before a single shot was fired. The Iranian military had been preparing. They had spent billions purchasing advanced radar systems, including the controversial Vostok 1, a Russian-supplied system that Iranian state media claimed to detect stealth targets like the F-35 at distances up to 400 kilometers. They had mobilized their air force, activated their surface-to-air missile batteries, and positioned their Soviet-era MiG-29s and homegrown F-7 fighters across their air bases. General Amir Hatami, Iran's defense minister, had declared with grim determination that their air defense network was impenetrable, a wall of steel and fire that would incinerate any American aircraft daring to enter Iranian airspace. On January 31st, just hours before the operation would unfold, Iran announced live-fire naval drills near American warships, a last desperate display of military capability designed to project strength and deterrence. They were wrong. Catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. What Iran failed to understand, what their military planners completely underestimated, was the technological chasm between their defensive systems and America's stealth aircraft. This wasn't a matter of having better equipment or more advanced radars. This was something entirely different. This was the difference between a chess master and someone who had never played the game before. This was the gap between a lion and a rabbit. The technology gap wasn't measured in increments or percentages. It was measured in orders of magnitude, an entire dimensional gulf that neither Iranian engineers, nor their Russian advisors, nor their Chinese suppliers could bridge. The F-22 Raptor, America's most lethal air-to-air fighter, operates at a radar cross-section so minuscule that it appears on conventional radars as little more than a bird or a weather phenomenon. Its shape, every curve and angle, has been meticulously engineered to deflect radar waves away from their source. The aircraft's fuselage, wings, and control surfaces are covered in radar-absorbing materials so sophisticated that classified defense engineers refuse to fully discuss their composition. These aircraft don't hide from radar, they fundamentally change. Radar perceives them. To an Iranian radar operator staring at his screen, an F-22 at close range might appear as nothing more than noise, a phantom signal that flickers and dies. And when you add the F-22's ability to detect enemy radar systems from hundreds of miles away and strike them with precision-guided missiles before those radars even knew what was happening, the equation became a mathematical certainty of American victory. Then there was the F-35 Lightning II, a different beast entirely but equally formidable. Where the F-22 was designed as a dogfighter of unparalleled capability, the F-35 was a network predator connected to an ecosystem of sensors and intelligence systems that gave the American military a godlike omniscience across the battlefield. Imagine a fighter pilot who'd see everything happening within a 1,000-mile radius, who knew the position of every enemy aircraft, every air defense system, every command center, and every military asset it was detected. That was the F-35. These aircraft carry advanced electronic warfare systems that don't just passively receive enemy radar signals. They actively jam and deceive them, transforming the very concept of detection into a meaningless gesture. An F-35 could fly through the most sophisticated air defense network, completely invisible not just to radar, but to every sense the enemy possessed. The journey of these magnificent machines to their operational areas began in earnest on January 29. Air Force B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, themselves aerial ghosts that register on radar with a cross-section smaller than a marble, took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. These weren't the first B-2 missions to Iran. In June 25, a devastating Midnight Hammer operation saw 7 B-2 Spirits conduct a 37-hour aerial odyssey, flying all the way to Iran, dropping over a dozen precision-guided munitions and returning to Missouri of 14,500 miles that demonstrated the unmatched global reach of American military power. What made that June operation so significant was not just the bombs they dropped or the targets they destroyed, but the message it sent. The United States could strike anywhere on Earth, anytime it wanted, and there was nothing any nation could do to prevent it. Behind these B-2s came waves of F-22s and F-35s, the tip of a spear that stretched back through the Mediterranean and into bases across the Middle East. F-35 station, or UAE, and Saudi Arabia were put on high alert. These aircraft represented a generational leap in combat capability. Each F-35 isn't just a fighter plane, it's a flying computer, a sensor platform that can detect, track, and eliminate targets that other aircraft can't even see. The stealth coatings on these machines, refined and improved over decades, absorb radar energy that would normally bounce back to radar dishes. The design itself, every dimension calculated by supercomputers and tested in wind tunnels thousands of times, creates a shape that seems to actively resist detection. Meanwhile, Iran was activating every air defense system it possessed. The Vostok 1 radar, that Russian marvel that Iranian officials claimed could detect stealth aircraft from extraordinary distances, was switched on. Command centers across northern Iran hummed with activity as radar operators positioned themselves at their stations, hands hovering over buttons and switches, ready for the confrontation they believed was imminent. They believed in their defenses. They believed their combination of Soviet, Russian, and homegrown systems could create a protective umbrella over Iranian territory. They were placing their faith in numbers and distribution. If they had enough radar sites, if they scattered their anti-aircraft batteries across enough locations, surely something would break through the American veil of invisibility. This was the fundamental misconception. Iran was fighting a war of the past against an enemy wielding the weapons of the future. The operational doctrine for American stealth operations is elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. First, the F-22s would penetrate deep into enemy airspace, their stealth characteristics allowing them to operate completely undetected. These aircraft would use their advanced radar systems to locate enemy air defense radar, command centers, and any airborne threats. While remaining completely invisible, they would relay this information back to the broader network of American military assets. Then, at a predetermined moment, the F-22s would strike. Using their air-to-air missiles, specifically the AI-120 MRAM missile, they could shoot down Iranian fighters from ranges of 40 miles or more, long before those fighters even knew the F-22s were there. The Iranian pilots would be vectored toward targets they could never see, trying to defend against threats that appeared to materialize out of thin air. Simultaneously, the F-35s would engage Iranian air defense systems using AGM-158 JASMRUS missiles, precision weapons that fly at low altitude, following terrain contours, and approach their targets from directions and altitudes the enemy radars weren't watching. These missiles, guided by GPS and terrain matching, would streak toward Iranian radar sites, command centers, and air bases with surgical precision. By the time Iranian operators realized what was happening, their most capable air defense systems would already be burning wreckage. The older Soviet-era SA-6 and SA-8 systems, though numerous, would sitting ducks to a systematic onslaught they couldn't see coming and couldn't defend against. What made this scenario so one-sided, so thoroughly devastating in its implications, was that Iranian military planners had no effective counter-strategy. They couldn't deploy enough interceptor aircraft to cover the airspace when they didn't know where the American aircraft were. They couldn't move their radar systems quickly enough to avoid being targeted because American stealth aircraft could locate them and call in strikes faster than Iranian commanders could react. They couldn't communicate effectively with their forces because American electronic warfare systems could jam their radio frequencies. The traditional rules of engagement, the tactical doctrines that had governed air combat for decades, simply didn't apply anymore. Some analysts had suggested that Iran's fourth-generation fighter fleet, consisting of aging F-7s, MiG-29s, and some F-4 Phantoms that were old enough to be museum pieces, might pose some minimal threat to American operations. This analysis was not just wrong, it was absurdly, laughably wrong. A fourth-generation fighter jet, no matter how well piloted or how numerous, was essentially defenseless against a fifth-generation American stealth fighter. The radar on an F-22 or F-35 detect a conventional fighter from 40 to 60 miles away. The conventional fighter's radar can detect the American stealth aircraft from perhaps 5 to 10 miles, and even that assumed optimal conditions and a degree of technical sophistication that Iranian systems might not possess. This meant American pilots had 4 to 6 times the detection range. They would see Iranian fighters coming and could launch missiles before those Iranian pilots had any idea American aircraft were even in the area. Consider a concrete scenario that played out with horrifying regularity during America's previous Middle East air campaigns. An Iranian MiG-29 pilot, one of the more competent ones, climbs to altitude in his aging aircraft. His radar is swept ahead of him, searching for targets. He has maybe 50 miles of radar range under perfect conditions. Then, without warning, his aircraft is illuminated by the targeting radar of an F-2 Raptor positioned 80 miles away and above his aircraft by 10,000 feet. The Iranian pilot never sees it coming on his radar display. The F-22 is still beyond his radar horizon, hidden not just by stealth but by the tactical geometry of the engagement. An AIM-2020 AMRAAM missile is fired. It streaks forward at Mach 4, traveling through the air at over 4,500 miles per hour. The Iranian pilot, if he's extremely alert, might get a warning light on his display indicating he's being tracked by radar. He has perhaps 90 seconds before the missile arrives. His only options are to dive, turn hard, deploy flares, and hope. But there's a problem. The missile is guided by a sophisticated algorithm that makes it nearly impossible to defeat with conventional countermeasures. The Iranian pilot watches his wingman's aircraft in a sphere of fire. His wingman didn't even get a warning. Then he's dead too. This scenario, multiplied across dozens of sorties and hundreds of engagements, would be the inevitable result of any scale American air operation against Iran. The Iranian Air Force would be methodically and completely destroyed without inflicting a single casualty on American forces. Not a single American aircraft would be shot down. Not a single American pilot would have to eject and run through the desert. The casualty count would be entirely one-sided. But the air campaign wasn't just about eliminating Iranian aircraft. American planners had identified exactly which targets needed to be struck to completely paralyze Iranian military command and control. The Revolutionary Guard's Air Defense Command Center near Tehran Awak's aircraft detected its exact location through signals intelligence. The main radar facilities controlling northern airspace. The missile storage facilities where Iran kept its supply of surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles. The air bases where Iran's most capable fighters were stationed. All of these would be struck simultaneously in a coordinated campaign of destruction. The operation, if it occurred, would resemble the 1991 Gulf War's opening night, a display of technological dominance so complete that the outcome was determined before the first shot was fired, before the first bomb fell, before the first aircraft launched its missiles. The frightening reality for Iran was this technological gap wasn't something that could be closed quickly. They couldn't buy better aircraft on the international market. They were subject to arms embargoes. They couldn't develop stealth technology themselves. It required industrial capacity and technical knowledge they didn't possess. They could buy more advanced radar systems from Russia or China, but here's what they didn't understand. Those radars were designed to counter aircraft from 15 or 20 years ago, not the latest generation of American stealth. A S-400 or S-500 radar system was significantly better than the systems Iran currently possessed, but it still operated on the same fundamental principle as older radars. It bounced radio waves off targets and listened for the echoes. A properly designed stealth aircraft like the F-22 or F-35 was engineered specifically to defeat this principle. The January 30th, 2020's tensions, now at their peak, represented the culmination of a strategic reality that had been building for months. After the June 2025 strikes, after the Iranian-Israeli 12-day war that devastated Iranian military infrastructure, after the economic crisis that had paralyzed the Iranian economy and left the regime desperate and dangerous, the window for American military action had remained open. Trump had made his position absolutely clear in his public statements. He wanted a nuclear deal, but he wanted it on American terms. He wanted Iran to abandon its regional proxy network, to rein in its militias, to accept international inspections of its nuclear facilities. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, had refused to budge. His advisors had warned him that capitulation would make the regime appear weak, inviting internal dissent and external aggression. So Khamenei had chosen defiance. What Khamenei and his military commanders had fatally misunderstood was that in the modern era, defiance suicidal when your opponent possessed such overwhelming technological superiority. The strategic calculus of warfare had changed. This wasn't 1973 when an Arab coalition could achieve initial military success through surprise and numbers. This wasn't even 2003 when resistance could be offered through conventional military means. This was 2026, and the United States possessed weapons systems so advanced, so lethal, so impossible to defend against that the only viable Iranian strategy was to avoid confrontation entirely. By rejecting diplomacy and preparing to fight, Iran wasn't preparing for war, it was preparing for annihilation. As January 30th progressed into January 31st, the situation became increasingly surreal. Iran announced live-fire naval drills. American reconnaissance drones continued their silent vigil over Iranian territory. Communications intercepts showed Iranian military units moving into defensive positions. The Iranian government released statements claiming their defenses were ready, their forces prepared, their determination unshakable. Behind closed doors, however, military planners were experiencing dawning horror as they calculated what would happen if American forces actually attacked. Every mathematical model, every tactical computer simulation, every war game scenario produced the same catastrophic conclusion: Iran would lose utterly and completely. Their military would be devastated. Their economy would be destroyed. The regime itself would be threatened with collapse. The technological asymmetry was so extreme that it created a kind of surreal unreality. Here was a nation with 80 million people, a defense budget of billions of dollars, a military force of hundreds of thousands, a nuclear program under development, and possession of advanced missiles capable of striking targets throughout the Middle East and beyond. And yet none of this mattered in the face of a handful of American stealth aircraft piloted by highly trained pilots with access to the most sophisticated targeting and navigation systems ever created. This was the new face of modern warfare, and it was utterly ruthless in its implications. Technology had created an asymmetry so profound that it was almost impossible to comprehend. The military balance didn't just favor one side, it was so skewed that it made the possibility of meaningful resistance almost laughable. The F-22s and F-35s that were moving into position on January 30th represented something almost philosophical in their perfection. These weren't crude instruments of destruction, they were surgical tools of extraordinary precision. Every aspect of their design, from the weapons they carried to the software that ran their systems, had been optimized to dominate air combat. The research and development that had gone into creating them, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment spread across multiple decades. The best aerospace engineers on the planet, people with PhDs from MIT and Caltech, people who had spent their entire careers mastering the arcane sciences of aerodynamics, stealth design, and weapon systems integration, had poured their genius into making these aircraft perfect predators of the sky. What was particularly humbling for Iranian military planners was that there was no defense, no tactic, no clever strategy that could overcome this technological gap. You couldn't hide from an F-22's radar. You couldn't outfly it. The F-22 was faster and more maneuverable. You couldn't outfight it. Its weapons were superior and its pilots were better trained. You couldn't defeat it with numbers because it engaged targets from such distances that opposing fighters would never get close enough to be a threat. You couldn't jam its communications because American forces used encrypted, laser-guided, and extremely secure communication systems. You couldn't anticipate its tactics because American pilots had trained for years specifically to fight aircraft like those Iran possessed. There was no symmetry in this confrontation. There was no balance. There was only overwhelming American dominance. The morning of January 31st, 2026, dawned with the sense that the world was on the precipice of something unprecedented. The media had been reporting intensively on the American military buildup. International diplomats were making last-ditch efforts at negotiation. Behind the scenes, military commanders on both sides were making final preparations for operations that might never occur. The question that hung in the air was whether Iran would capitulate to American demands, whether Trump would make good on his threats to strike. The answer to this question would determine whether the United States would demonstrate the complete obsolescence of Iranian air defenses, or whether, through some combination of diplomacy and restraint, the crisis would be de-escalated and a conflict avoided. But one thing was absolutely certain: if the order to attack was given, if American stealth fighters were unleashed against Iran, the outcome would never be in doubt. The radars that Iran had spent billions to acquire, the air defense systems that Iranian generals claimed were impregnable, the fighters that Iran had fielded, such pride, all of it would be rendered completely ineffective, not by overwhelming numbers or brute force, but by sheer technological superiority. American stealth aircraft would make Iranian radars look invisible, not to the naked eye but to all practical military purposes. They would make the billion-dollar radar installations seem like artifacts from an earlier era, as obsolete as the Wright brothers compared to the space shuttle. They would demonstrate to the entire world in the arena of advanced air combat there was no peer competitor to American military aviation, only the United States, and there was everyone else falling further and further behind with each passing year. This was the reality of modern warfare. This was what happened when one nation invested massively in the latest military technology, while its adversaries were forced to make do with older systems, more limited resources, and inferior technology. technical sophistication. The asymmetry wasn't just military, it was technological, economic, educational, and institutional. The United States had spent decades perfecting the art of stealth aviation. It had invested in the best scientists, the best engineers, the best pilots, and the best training programs. It had created an entire ecosystem of defense contractors, research institutions, and military units all focused on maintaining air superiority. The result was a force that was simply incomparable. As the hours ticked by on that last day of January, as the American military forces held their positions and waited for orders that might or might not come, one thing was clear. The game board had been set, the pieces had been positioned, and the outcome was already determined. If conflict came, American stealth fighters would dominate Iranian airspace with absolute finality. The radar systems that Iranian military planners had been so proud of would not slow them down for even a moment. The air defenses that had been so carefully prepared and positioned would be destroyed faster than Iranian commanders could report them as threats. The fighters that Iran had sent aloft would be eliminated without inflicting a single scratch on American forces. The result would be a demonstration of technological dominance so complete, so overwhelming, that it would reshape the military balance of the entire Middle East and send a message to every nation watching that the power disparity between the United States and potential adversaries had reached a point of almost comic proportions. This was the story of stealth aviation in 2026. This was the story of how American machines of war, the product of decades of research and billions of dollars of investment, had rendered obsolete every air defense system deployed by traditional military powers. This was the story of how, in the modern era, technological superiority didn't just help it created chasms so wide that no amount of courage, determination, or manpower could bridge it. And this was the story that would play out if on January 31st, 2026, the United States gave the order to strike. The radars would go dark, the fighters would fall from the sky. Iranian air defenses would cease to exist, and American stealth fighters would rule the skies unopposed, making the very concept of Iranian radar defense seem like nothing more than an invisible ghost, present in name only, powerless to affect the unfolding catastrophe above Iranian territory.